My name is Lynnette Grey Bull. I reside here at the Wind River Reservation in the heart of Wyoming. I'm so honored to be part of this panel. I'm, glad to be invited to the table to discuss issues that we are discussing today. I've done a lot of work in sexual assault advocacy, missing, murdered Indigenous women advocacy, and children and women who've been exploited and trafficked, both in the country and both for just across the state as an advocate for child sex trafficking. And so about 7 years ago, I was working on a project and a documentary with a documentary crew on how exploitation and sexual assault is parallel to the fracking industry. And so we visited different reservations and interviewed different key players across reservations on how the fracking industry, the oil and gas industry that has been implemented in their community, whether on or off the reservation. And one of those places we visited was up in Newtown, Williston area in North Dakota. My time that I spent up there working with this organization as a tribal liaison, we were able to talk to people both on and off the reservation about the fracking industry that has impeded in their community. There was a few factors there. One of the factors was that because of the fracking industry in this region, the multitude of oil workers has influxed at a great rate. So at the time, I think this was about 2014, the ratio there at that time was 15 men to 1 woman in this small region. And what we learned, kind of living there for a little while, just to gather some stories in this region, was that women and children, whether it was daytime, whether it was nighttime, we're always advised not to go anywhere alone. Only because of the high rates of sexual assault, high rates of attacks of possible rape and or abduction. We interviewed schools both off and on the reservation, and schools had to stop letting their children walk home from school because children were either being attempted abduction or sexual assault or molestation was occurring to children. Now, this was occurring to a community as a whole, so it wasn't just impact the Native community, but it was also impacting, the neighboring towns of Newtown and Williston. So, I mean, and keep in mind, this was a time where it was a boom. There was an influx of oil workers in this region with the plethora of man camps, and there was men across the world. We interviewed oil workers that came from Russia, that came from, Japan. I mean, there was just an influx of men that came from all across the globe, to come make $50 an hour or possibly more because of the oil and fracking industry. But what we also learned was the environmental impact that took place in that region. It takes about 500 semi-trucks to frack to facilitate one fracking site. So all hours of the night there was traffic, and all hours of the night you would see truckers, up and down the highway. It created a lot of traffic. Anywhere we went, we were always in traffic. In addition to that, because there were so many truckers in this region going in and out of this place, I don't know what you call it, but the plastic containers that truckers urinate in when they drive, they were all over the highway. The highway, the roads, they were all flooded with these plastic urinated containers. So there was different elements of climate or regional impacts not only because of the fracking, not only because of the water in that region was destroyed. I believe at that time, the hotel that we were residing at, the water was over conditioned. So the water was like really thick. And even after you took a shower, the residue was on your skin and in your hair. It was a really just weird and strange experience. But the people in this region has suffered and continue to suffer this because of the fracking industry had basically just took over the reservation and even off the reservation. And we've interviewed law enforcement in the region. We interviewed tribal council. And when we speak with law enforcement, because of the high rates of sexual assault, the high rates of exploitation, obviously there was a lot of money to be made because there was a lot of men away from their homes, living in Newtown or Williston. And so the exploitation is kind of what I was kind of zeroing in on, especially with exploitation of children and child sex trafficking and human trafficking. And basically what we found and learned from at this time from the FBI, the law enforcement that we were able to sit down and have conversations with, was that they weren't even able to, you know, address the issues of sexual assault or rape or even human trafficking because they were too busy trying to contain the drug trafficking in this region. So again, there was different elements of impacts on the environment, but there also was crucial impacts on the people who lived in this region. There was a lot of stories that came off the reservation. You know, sometimes when you live in a disadvantaged community, you know, things were being proposed to young, both girls and boys in that region for jobs. So we've talked to young Native girls and boys that, you know, thought they were answering an ad for work, when really when they got to the place to clean, or they came to a place to answer calls, they were actually coerced into and being exploited into trafficking. So, and I think the youngest person that the cases that we were able to review was a 3-year-old that was being trafficked in these man camps. And a lot of these young people were being held without their consent. And some of them spent weeks and sometimes months in these man camps, being exploited and kind of passed around until they were able to escape or they were able to get help from somebody. And so this was the kind of cases and things that we were learning while visiting this region and interviewing people. The schools that we interviewed and spoke with said that there were a lot of abduction and molestation attempts because of the oil workers. So most schools, both off and on the reservation, had stopped letting their children walk to and from school. There was a lot of protocols in place to protect children. And then also when it came to just women in general, there was a lot of sexual assault and assaults against women, mostly Native American victims in this place, in this region, was being impacted. The tribes and the councils that we interviewed from MHA Nation, they felt like they had no control. They had no viable way to, how do we handle this? You know, how do we approach this? What do we do? Again, you know, just keep in mind, this was during a time where it was booming. It was a modern day boomtown. And so these are the things that I've learned, you know, working on the sexual assault of things and working from a tribal community aspect of it, on how the oil and fracking industry has just took over this region and kind of just destroyed the entire, not just from the environmental aspect of it, but also from a community level. And we see the same story going. You know, we talk about South America and, you know, other places where Indigenous people live and reside, and, you know, they live and this is their home, but they're being disbanded or displaced or even murdered and killed because of the industry that is impeding in their just regular way of life. And then when we talk about, environmental racism also has impacted tribal communities. With continued drilling and mining on tribal lands, I know that's something that has been an issue here for Wind River, but I don't think it's. I believe that everybody should have access to clean water and clean land. From a cultural perspective, we are taught to take care of our land and to take care of our water, because in return, it takes care of you. And so not only, I think, tribes that have been impacted by the fracking or extractive industry, not only have they been impacted, in terms of kind of bringing distortion in their community, but it also impedes in our cultural values and our cultural aspects that we believe in, as far as protecting our land and water. I think my time is up, but those are the things I think is important to continue to talk about, because when it comes to environmental justice, conservation, having a seat at the table, most often Native Americans or Native American representatives are not welcome to that table. So I think this is vital moving forward, as far as how do we move forward and create social justice for climate change and create justice for Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Okay, you had me muted. So thank you very much, Lynnette. That's one of the things with all this Zoom stuff is when you're not in charge of your mute, you can't unmute. Very good point about some of the many things that come with oil and gas development. And that's one issue we don't hear enough about, and how it affects people other than just the fracking and what happens to the land, but also what happens to the people. And we'll come back to you, Lynnette, I'm sure, with questions there. Our second speaker is Steff Kessler, who obtained her master's degree in planning and policy from Harvard University. Is that in Wyoming? I don't think it is, but I didn't know she was a Harvard grad. Anyway, it led her to work with the National Outdoor Leadership School, the Alaska Center for the Environment, and presently with the Wyoming Outdoor Council. Steff has managed a successful legislative campaign to create the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust, which provides money here in the state, and later opened and staffed the Wilderness Society's Wyoming office. Now, during this time, along with her partners, helped secure, and we were one of the partners, by the way, and WIN, helped secure passage of the Wyoming Range Legacy Act and the protection of the Upper Hoback, served on the state's ozone task force, and was appointed by the Secretary of Interior to the Pinedale Anticline Working Group. She resides outside of Lander, near the Wind River Reservation, with her husband, John Gans, and their 3 children. And I'll point out also that this is my own personal comment here. Steff is really a legend in this state when it comes to environmental work. And she has worked with us very closely, both on the On Sacred Ground project and, of course, with the Wyoming Range. So Steff, if you'll go ahead and pick that up and maybe even challenge us faith people in what we can do best.
Wow. Thank you for that great introduction. And thank you, the Wyoming Interfaith Network, for putting on this great program. It's really timely. I thought I'd just add that my work related to this topic, I draw upon 2 experiences. One of those is working on the Wind River Reservation with some people that are on this call. Shout out to Jolene. I haven't seen you in a long time. Would love to catch up. And of course with Lynnette and Jason, who are 2 great individuals that I work with and learn from all the time. And then the other I want to highlight, because I think it's important, is I worked for many years on pollution issues in North Casper. And I really want to add to the list of vulnerable communities, low income communities, which are often communities of color as well, as important for this discussion. I am a white person, and from what I can tell, most of you are white. So I've really prepared remarks more for this community in terms of just thinking about working with vulnerable communities or communities of color. And the first thing is just some personal thinking. I guess one of my guidelines is start where that community is. It's really important to recognize that you have experiences or perceptions that are not necessarily shared at all by the community you want to work with. You've got to get it in your head. It's not about you. You've got to start where those folks are. Spend time in the community, build relationships, listen. And the way they think about things may be very different from the way you even go about thinking about connecting with the environment. Just look at the issue that Lynnette brought up. How many of you, when you would have thought about fracking, would have gone to the issues regarding trafficking? But those are the issues that Native people have, and that's their issues, and you need to honor them. And it's not about your issues necessarily. Use of language and can even be something that keeps you away from understanding people's concerns about the environment. My worst example of that is when someone always talked about charismatic megafauna instead of just saying big game or elk. We're an overly educated crowd, and that can separate you from really doing good connection and work in support of these communities. You've got to build trust, and you've got to act on what are those communities' concerns, not necessarily yours. And I really want to point out that it's about sharing power, maybe even giving away power. Work in this field is not about telling people what they need to do for you, but rather listening and learning from them and hearing what they need. I tend to have this kind of Zen saying that we tell our staff about: if you want to win an environmental campaign, you have to give it away. You've got to give away your campaign to win it. And what that's about is that it has to belong to the people that you are working with. They have to have ownership, and you have to have a real fair and equal relationship with folks in those efforts. I also want to point out that our focus as predominantly well-educated, maybe well-off white people is not the same of a lot of communities that may be more disadvantaged. We tend to think a lot in Wyoming about our great outdoors, getting outside, the beautiful wildlife, whereas I'd say in my experience, there's some very different issues. Basic public health is often neglected in our state, but it's a very important environmental issue. Issues such as reliable and clean drinking water is important. Safe housing, even safe neighborhoods away from toxins, can be really important. I think one of the most polluted and dangerous areas in our state is probably where the Susquehanna mill tailings are that were dumped on the reservation. To this day, probably the most threatening to public health and safety. But these aren't kind of the quote sexy issues that conservation groups and environmentalists get involved in as much, because we're coming at it from our perspective and maybe not the perspective of these communities. There definitely is institutional racism in our state, particularly in state government. And I want to give you an example. I worked with the tribes to give them access to the Wyoming Water Development Account. The tribes pay money into what goes into our general fund through their severance tax on oil and gas, but they don't get the benefits or the access to programs even around the environment. And we had to go to the legislature and change the law so that tribal business councils would be eligible for grants for water development that could help with clean water, water storage, irrigation efficiencies, and all these things that the other communities have had for a long time. There are more of those inequities in our state government today. I think one of the things that we can do to help communities of color, especially the reservation and other communities, is to help them with their access to those resources, to level those playing fields. There's one I'm working on, or I want to work on soon. There's this account called the Federal Natural Resource Policy Account. It's money that the governor gives out to counties to help them engage on public lands issues. The tribes are not eligible for that fund. We need to change that language. I'm sure there's many, many more other examples. And so I think access to resources, to funds, and even to political power is really important. We are privileged, and if we can leverage that privilege to open up opportunities so that we kind of can address some of these systemic problems and at least provide some assistance so that Native voices or community voices can have equal access and equal power, I think that's really important for us. I will end by saying that Warren asked us to speak about, or I guess Jordan did, an actual campaign, and he did mention the Red Desert, and that's something that I think we have really tried to build by bringing in Indigenous leadership to that at the very beginning. And also assure that that access that we can help provide is there. An example of that is when Governor Gordon reached out to us and asked for a tour of the Red Desert. There was only 3 people that we took on that tour as our resource people for the entire time. And one of those slots was absolutely designated by us for a Native representative. That was Jason Baldus, who came on the trip, and I think really enlightened the governor and his staff about Indigenous concerns out there. So I just think there's a lot of important opportunities, and we just have to reflect on our maybe inability to see things, but to make sure that we open up the doors so that we can learn and provide access for these communities and join them in their efforts.
Well, thank you, Steff. That's good new stuff you're putting out there. And that's something I think we need to hear. And if you've got questions for either one of the last 2 speakers, please put it on the chat. Our third speaker is the aforementioned Jason Baldus, an enrolled member of the Eastern Shoshone Tribe. Received his bachelor's and master's degree in land resources and environmental sciences from Montana State, where he focused on the restoration of buffalo to the tribal lands. And in 2016, he spearheaded this successful effort to relocate a herd to the Wind River Indian Reservation. And I was really pleased that he took me out there to see those bison after they arrived. He is an advocate, educator, and a speaker on Indigenous cultural revitalization and ecological restoration. And he has served as director of the Wind River Native Advocacy Center, where he was instrumental in passing, and we, of course, joined with that effort, for passage of the Wyoming Indian Education for All Act, which is being used in our schools. He currently serves as the tribal buffalo coordinator for the National Wildlife Federation's Tribal Partnerships Program, Region 1 Director of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, and is Buffalo representative for the Eastern Shoshone Tribe. And I would add to that I've known Jason since his college days, actually. And I certainly know his dad, Dick Baldis, who is also one of my close associates. And also his dream was to see those bison be returned. So Jason, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you to everybody on the call. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you this evening and talk about this issue of race and the environment, and because it's really the foundational, and you know the history of this country isn't taught per se in the schools, and as Warren mentioned, the Indian Education for All Act is a step in the right direction. But realize that there's 576 federally recognized tribes in this country, not counting the state recognized tribes or the tribes that don't have recognition. There's over 330 distinct languages, and within those languages really is a worldview, a way of seeing the world, and a connection to the natural world, the environment, the land, the animals, the air, the water, all of creation. And when the relationships began after 1492 and later with treaties, it was a recognition of the federal government that these people were here. And so treaties, even if you look them up today, are said to be the supreme laws of the land. And there were over 800 treaties made. 400 of them or so were ratified by Congress. But the bottom line is that every single one of those treaties and agreements was violated in some way. And so there is the systemic problem goes back to those policies that were undermined. And this is all, we look at the intergenerational trauma of Native Americans today, the genocide with smallpox blankets, oppression, assimilation, ultimately even problems with alcohol and violence and other problems that we still have in our communities today. The intergenerational trauma that began with, my grandmas and grandpas, we still are feeling the effects of that. And as we heal the land, we also heal ourselves. And if we look at some of those policies, probably the most detrimental policy was the General Allotment Act that opened up reservations for homesteading. So the dismantling of the relationship of people, Native American people, to the landscape, because what existed here prior to European arrival and settlement was the wildlife economy. The people here thrived, and wealth was measured by the biodiversity of animals that existed here, the water, the clean water, the animals and the plants and the foods and the medicines that grow in abundance, if you know what you're looking for and how to find those things. The General Allotment Act promoted agriculture and the division of the land base, and that undermined that wildlife economy in the promotion of agriculture. And so the federal government promoted the use of water. We look at the prior appropriation doctrine or Western water law, the use it or lose it philosophy, a totally backward way to use water in a high elevation desert. The General Allotment Act that broke up those land holdings that were held in communal ownership by the people, that was divided up where people no longer had access to places to hunt and to harvest. And the systemic colonial ways of knowing in science and ecology is finally kind of reverting back to a holistic way of looking at the world. Well, that is what we knew and practiced. The medicine wheel philosophy is about wholeness, about understanding the pieces of the puzzle that fit together. And today, the holistic management process is something that's being reinvigorated or being brought into institutions to promote the understanding of how everything is created. Well, that's traditional ecological knowledge. In terms of buffalo, the restoration of bison to the reservation, not only this one, but to native communities, is really about healing. And I could have never known that my own healing was directly related to this buffalo and it coming back home and to our communities. Because when that food source was removed from us as a people, and that resulted in high rates of diabetes and heart disease and other health-related issues, because of that removal of that relationship that we had to that animal in our diet and his life's commissary. That buffalo was food, clothing, shelter, tools. It was the reason why we're here today. And that buffalo has been removed, and we've forgotten as Shoshones how to utilize that animal in a way. We still have it part of our ceremonies and things, but really reconnecting with that animal is about healing. And that's not only for us as Native people, but that's about the American people, because that's an American story. What happened to buffalo, what happened to Native American people. And as we bring that buffalo back, it's also about food sovereignty. Because as that buffalo was removed from our diet, removed from the landscape, and the Indians were forced onto reservations, well, it opened up large tracts of land in the West that are again promoted for agriculture. And so the cow is king. You know, in Wyoming, we're in the cowboy state. And so it's somewhat contrary to the norm of public to understand this connection that we have to buffalo. But really, it's not only about our cultural revitalization and making sure our kids are proud of who they are as Shoshones or Arapahoes or Crow or Lakota, because we as Buffalo people have that relationship. It's about food sovereignty and really being able to feed our people. And the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes have a history of conservation, like in 1984, reintroduction of the pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep that were extirpated. This has resulted in the wildlife management that makes our wildlife populations a sustainable populations for sustenance. And the last one that we need is buffalo, that we need that buffalo recognized as a wildlife to be managed as wildlife on the landscape. And this trickles over not only from our work in tribal buffalo restoration, but into public land use and revitalization. Because if we want to talk about healing the land and restoring ecological integrity, there's no better way to do that than putting back the keystone species, because buffalo as a keystone species benefit almost every other organism, from birds, from butterflies and insects. Their wallowing behavior is very important in seed dispersal and creating ephemeral pools that are important for water accumulation. And so buffalo restoration is about food sovereignty. It's about improving and healing ourselves from the inside out, but also about healing the land. If we think about climate change, you know, we've already had the longest running court case in the history of Wyoming about who controls water on the reservation, the Bighorn case. The tribes lost. They were advocating for the health of the fishery, and they lost the case because Wyoming says that agriculture is the only use of water in the state, even though the reservation was established well before Wyoming. Now, 35 to 45% of our flows of the Big Wind River are from glacial melt, and our scientific studies tell us that within 50 years, those glaciers are going to be gone. So we've already had a water war about how water gets used not only in the reservation, but in the state of Wyoming, and agriculture is a priority in high elevation desert. Well, what's that going to look like when there's 45% less flows in the Wind River? We're going to have to really think about how our relationship with that water is. Because for Native people, we have these sayings. The Lakota say "Mutakuye Oyasin," the Arapaho say "Inatinech," and the Shoshone say "Bah Nanashunte." This is how we say water is life. Water is sacred. It's holy. And we've had that understanding since time immemorial because we call it our first medicine. And that water is life. My grandma told me that one of the worst things that came to the reservation was the toilet, because to defecate in clean water is the most disrespectful thing you can do to clean water. So this is a worldview about how we see our relationship to the land, how we see our relationship to the water, to that buffalo, to the wildlife. And so those are very important things to do. But I think in this day and age, we have the opportunity for partnership and collaboration. And so like the buffalo restoration effort, it could have never happened without the National Wildlife Federation, or our work to connect and understand and protect areas in the Red Desert. To be able to have allyship in fighting for water in terms of the fish, not in terms of agriculture. And so how we utilize the land and our relationship to water and to the animals is very important. And for me, it's more important than that cow. But for that, with that, I'll go ahead and stop there. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I think I'll probably utilize my time. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you, Jason. Good presentation, and I like that story about the water in the wet toilet. Think about that. We should all think about that from now on. Jason, our director tells us that we do have a few more minutes than were originally allotted, and that will be good for some questions. And if you've got a couple, let me start with the two that I see up here. Let me combine it to Judith Eicher's question along with Katrina Bradley's question. I think we all know the reservation, and any of you can answer this. I think we all know the reservation is a special piece of ground. It's different than the rest of the state. And one of the issues I know I experienced living around the res and Lander was that a lot of people wanted to know about the reservation and talk to people there, but didn't know how to go about doing it. And how do you develop communication between people on the res and people outside? And maybe you all have some suggestions for doing that on this very different kind of piece of land. See who wants to tackle that one. If you would need to unmute, I think if Jordan can unmute the three of you. There we go. Somebody want to address that?
Warren, I'll go ahead and take a stab.
Sure.
Just a little bit of history again. In 1863, the Shoshone Reservation was 44 million acres. This was well before the state was established, but it would have been half of Wyoming, northern Colorado, northern Utah, and eastern Idaho, and most of what is now Yellowstone. Because of the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe, the Mormon trails that converged through South Pass, only 5 years later, our reservation was reduced by 42 million acres at the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. So in the span of 5 years, the Shoshone tribe lost 42 million acres. There were subsequent land reductions like the McLaughlin Agreement and the Bruno Cession. So if you think of Lander to South Pass, the tribe got $25,000 for that area. And of course, you know, millions and millions of dollars were taken out in gold and steel. And also the area of Thermopolis was the McLaughlin Agreement, which McLaughlin was the federal agent negotiating it, and it was supposed to be agreed upon that it was 1 mile by 1 mile, and he put zeros on the end of the ones and made it 10 miles by 10 miles, increasing the amount. And again, in 1887, the General Allotment Act, which created Riverton, which doesn't see itself within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. So subsequent chipping away of the reservation still continues, if you will, because really the lands north of the Big Wind River are still under dispute. And so the tribes, you know, I think in interacting with tribes and tribal members in this day and age is obviously very difficult with COVID, but I would encourage all of you at some point when things open up to attend a social celebration. Go to a powwow. Powwows are social celebrations where anybody is welcome to attend. We're in the day and age of social media. Add some friends from an institution or an organization that works on the reservation to learn about some of the issues that we're working on and dealing with. You know, the natural resource issues open up a lot of conversation because the tribes manage wolves and bears, and we have a successful wildlife management. If anybody wants to go fishing, the best fishing in the nation is on the reservation through the wilderness area that's accessible by foot or horseback. It was the first wilderness area in the United States, developed 26 years before the Federal Wilderness Act. Happened in 1938, and of course the Wilderness Act was in '64. And so there's lots of opportunities. If you want to go see the buffalo, contact me and we can arrange a trip to go out there and see the buffalo and have a conversation about some of these issues that are going on. I know Lynnette would be a great contact to learn more about some of the issues that we have on the reservation with our social issues, housing issues, some of the problems that we have contemporarily, and maybe ways that you can, because of social media, you can go and like pages elsewhere of tribal efforts going on to stand up for sovereignty. Everybody's heard of Standing Rock, but there's a lot of tribes that are still fighting pipelines. There's tribes that are fighting for the salmon rights and recovery. And I don't know if many of you saw today that the decline in our animal biodiversity is decreasing rapidly. Well, this is again part of that wildlife economy that was so important here prior to settlement, because that's where the wealth really was, and our connection to that is still here if you can find the people to go to. So I'd encourage you to reach out to me if you need to, or I'm sure Lynnette is open to that as well. But I think we could point you to people on the reservation here, as well as others that may be able to assist in that. So thanks.
Great. Lynnette or Steff, either one of you want to add to that? We need
All right, there we go.
There you go.
Yeah, he unmuted me. You know what? I truly, I could concur with what Jason has stated, but I think to interact with different reservations or reservations in your backyard, and I think Stephanie Kessler does a fine example of this. It's just simply reaching out and just, you know, having a conversation with somebody, or you know, just to kind of you know, support what Jason Valdez has said. You know, reach out to somebody you do know, and they're able to connect you to people who might, especially when it comes to a topic or a subject, will connect you to that person. There's so many great advocates across our reservation, both near and far, that do just a lot of work for Indian country, not just for Wind River, but just, you know, Indian country as a whole. There's so much going on across Indian country that needs a lot more support and a lot more advocacy to get the justice, or the social justice, or the climate justice that they're looking for. And so again, you know, Tomato, Stephanie Kessler's work here, living here in Fremont County, you know, just reaching out to your fellow neighbor and saying, hey, you know, I want to know how I can get involved. I want to know if I can talk to somebody, you know, about this issue or that issue. You know, a number of years ago, I worked on food security and providing sustainability throughout different reservations, and I targeted the 5 poorest reservation in the nation, And I had to cross lines too. I had to, most of my support and foundation was from churches, different denominations that came on board to help me get establish a food service, food boxes for elders and for families in need across different reservations. And I had to reach out to all kinds of people, not just people in leadership, but people in policy, people in churches, people throughout the community. And so I think when you just reach out and just, want to have a fellow conversation with your neighbor or somebody who may live across the country, you will always find people who will connect you to the movers and shakers of that community. You will find people who have the shared mission and the shared passion and compassion for people. And that's been my experience. There's a lot of bridges that needs to take place when working with Indian country. There's a lot of untrust. There's a lot of things that have happened in the past that, prohibits some members or tribes from working with outsiders only because of either they exploited their need or they exploited, the issue that they were facing only to benefit for themselves and not really benefit the Native community as a whole. So yes, of course, there's some past things that has happened, but I think for any of us who focuses on community well-being, especially from a faith base, there's always good work to be done. And when you're doing good work, God has a way of connecting to people that needs to be connected and has a way of connecting people who are going to promote the good in the community. That's always been my experience, no matter what I was tackling or what hat I was wearing. I was always connected with good people who are willing to come alongside and do the good work as well. Sometimes I do believe we all have different purposes and different gifts, and we all play different roles in that. But I think just focusing on just reaching out to other communities or other persons, or maybe somebody who is connected to tribal advocates is a good start.
Great. Jordan, do we have time for Steff to make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we do have a little more time here. Steff, I know you want to add to it.
I don't know if I have a lot to add to that. I agree with everything that's been said. I do believe it's important to support leaders. Stepping out can be tough, and we need to support the people that are Native leaders that are really making a difference. We've got great folks here on the reservation that are doing that, and the more that we can get behind them and stand with them. I also think sometimes adding your voice in support of what those issues are can really help. I just think there's a lot of opportunity here, and to add our voice and to just support a lot of the leaders, like Lynnette and Jason that are here now. Andy Clifford in the state legislature is another leader, and there's plenty more, and there's some great work being done.
Great. A question that goes with that then, and I'd love to hear just a brief answer from everybody, is what do you think that the churches that surround the reservation could be doing to make this whole issue come alive? What can they do? Any suggestions?
I have a history working with different churches, especially in regards to helping the Native community. I think that the past experiences I had that were successful working with churches and helping community well-being in tribal communities is that I think it's in the comments too, is just it's a humble approach. I believe that anytime that you're trying to help any community or any project or any topic, you first come to learn versus coming to try to teach somebody something or teach them this is we did it this way and it works this way. And I think that approach kind of turns off tribal advocates, only because we have a lot of different people that we, especially with tribal leadership, that integrates with other entities, and they try to tell them how to fix their community. That approach never works well for anybody. I think if you come from a good place, and of course I'm pretty sure everybody has good motives and intentions, but also just to be kind, just regular compassion, working with your fellow person and neighbor is a good approach. I've had a lot of different church partnerships who've asked, how can I help, or how can I, there was a lot of them that just wanted to come on the reservation and just interact with the community. And all those things are great. But of course, we're living in a pandemic right now. It's a little bit different. But, those approaches are also received well. I know that, with my family, we get a lot of people, a lot of visitors, especially from other places, who just want to come learn or just want to just visit with us. And, those things are always welcome. I think just the human aspect of just connecting with people is always a good approach, no matter if it's business or, just connecting with a community you haven't connected with. But I can always guarantee you, if you reach out to a disadvantaged community of any sort or of any race, you're going to find there's going to be a need, and there's a way to fulfill that need. Sometimes, just simply asking and connecting with somebody from that community can lead you on how you can also be an important key role and advocate in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Good advice. Steff or Jason, real quick, any suggestion on how the churches can be more active in involving themselves for the rest?
Well, I echo what Lynnette said, and I seen that Chessie Lee in the comments said, support the Get Out to Vote effort. And I think it's really about supporting some of the community-led efforts. My sister Roxanne Friday at the Episcopal Church in Fort Washakie has been extremely helpful in like the food distribution. And I think being able to help out with some of those efforts, and even during times like now with COVID, there's still opportunities for people to learn about what's going on the reservation and be able to engage. And I think that the churches and pastors are a great avenue for that. And just coming to the reservation, just come and visit. And go and have coffee with folks. But I think, people are looking for help during this time of struggle. And I think the churches can help fulfill that need. I attend, sweat ceremonies and cedarings and things like that to assist. But the church helps in that way too, to give people that comfort and healing. Is just being there as a place to go for that kind of help is important, and keeping the doors open.
Great. Steff, last word.
It's amazing how people that live in the surrounding towns close to the reservation can be so ignorant about just what the reservation is like and people and having those connections. And I remember there was a group that some of the women in Lander and the reservation formed called the Wind River Women's Consortium, where we just got together as women and from both town and the reservation and talked and just connected and had opportunity to have conversations and really learn more. And it could, that the churches could be a great forum or a convener of some of those opportunities. because it's really surprising to me how I bump into people and they're like, I've never been to a powwow. And it's like, wow. And so churches could be helpful in facilitating those beginning connections, maybe, and get the kind of conversations going that can lead to then further bridge building.
Great. Church field trips to powwow sounds like a good idea. I think that might be a winner. But I think all your comments are very good because as I know, as you know, Steff, churches around the reservation seem to have a deaf ear to what is said, and many of them won't even go there. So that needs to be overcome. One of my dreams was always to see, and I don't know, maybe somebody can answer this question, open up that Chief Washakie pool again and have a great big pool gathering for people. You know, we did that years ago, and unfortunately it's now closed. But anyway, Jordan, what's the story? Do we have more time, or do you want to move on?
I think we should probably wrap up and let our panelists go for the night.
Sure. Thank you all. It's wonderfully educational and hopefully inspirational enough that we can, both as Wynn and others who are just joining in, can make an effort to continue their education on this issue and be more involved.
Yeah, thanks, Warren, and thanks to the On Sacred Ground team for helping organize that panel, and obviously Lynnette, Steff, and Jason. We can't thank you enough for offering your wisdom and your insight and your voice.